Thank you everybody for attending. And this is our last event of the winter, or I'm sorry, of the fall. It feels like winter in a speaker series we've been doing this fall that is highlighting African diaspora, history, and activism. So this is kind of a perfect final speaker for the fall. And we do have additional speakers in winter term, and just stay till the end and you can find out a little bit of information about them. So I'm the director, sorry to change the slides again, I'm the director of the School of History, Philosophy, and Religious Studies. So if you have any questions about any of our speakers or presentations, feel free to email me at the email there, and I'd be happy to hear from anybody in our audience about these topics. And I'm going to introduce now Professor Miguel Valerio, who is from Washington University in St. Louis. So let me just pull up my introduction for Professor Valerio. He has a PhD from the Ohio State University, and he teaches in Romance languages at Washington University in St. Louis. And so his work deals with African diaspora history. Hold on one second, just doing some technical difficulties here so I can get my screen share. Sorry about that. So yes, Professor Valerio is joining us today, and he has a specialty on Africans in Latin America, broadly in the African diaspora, and he's focused on religious brotherhoods and religious festive practices. So he has a book manuscript that has to do with Africans and their descendants in the Viceroyalty of New Spain or Mexico and their festive practices. And he takes us all the way back to the late medieval Renaissance era. And he also works on a variety of other areas in the African diaspora. So today his talk is going to include information about Brazil, and I assume other places as well. This is a really interesting topic for me because this is what I did my dissertation on. So it's really great to see this topic flourishing, almost 2 decades after. There's a lot of new books being written on this, and Dr. Valerio is one of the leading people on this topic. So he's going to give us a kind of longer history of Black activism and resistance hemispherically in his talk today. So thank you so much for joining us, and we will have questions after the formal talk, especially interested in student questions. So please send those along after Professor Valerio finishes his formal remarks. All right, thanks so much.
Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to begin by thanking Professor Hermetten for including me in this series. I am very honored. And for everyone who has worked so hard to make it possible behind the scenes. And everyone who is here tonight. I'm sad that I can't see you and we can't interact face to face, but I'm happy you're here. And so tonight, as Professor Hermetten said, I will be speaking about activism and resistance in colonial Latin America in a hemispheric, from a hemispheric point of view, from Mexico to Brazil. I will be speaking about what I call 2 forms of resistance, outright resistance. And so at the beginning, we're gonna talk about some very active form of resistance that Afro descendants during the colonial period in Spain and Portugal's empire took. And then I'm going to talk about another form of resistance that is the one that makes up most of my research. And I use the term that Sadeya Hartman, the historian, coined, which is called everyday resistance. So these are less, if you will, less active, less proactive forms of resistance, but they're still active and very significant forms of resistance. And we will see as we get into this what I mean. So first, if you have been attending the series, you have probably learned a lot about the Black population in in colonial Latin America, so I won't dwell too much on that. I will just start by saying that people of African descent were in the Iberian Peninsula in Spain and Portugal before Columbus crossed the Atlantic. So this is a picture of Lisbon as a very busy city with a large Black population. And the same thing was true of Barcelona, Valencia, and Seville. So the Iberian Mediterranean had a large population, and some of these Africans in the Iberian Peninsula were the first to come to the America with the Spanish before the slave trade started bringing Africans directly from Africa. So in this picture, we see a Black conquistador over here. It could be any number of persons. There were hundreds of people who accompany the Spanish as they colonized the Americas. Some of these are known by name, Juan Garrido, Juan Cortés, who were personal servants of Hernan Cortés. So this is Cortés, and this will be one of his personal servants, Black person servant, as Cortés meets Moctezuma. If you're further interested in this, there's an article called Black Conquistadors that studies this, and there's an article called Mexican Manuscripts, which studies the representation of Africans in Mexican manuscripts of the conquest. But the largest number of Africans to come to the Americas, as we know, was through the slave trade. And Latin America got most of the people that came to the Americas. Brazil alone got 5 million. Mexico was said to have around 200,000 going to Mexico. And you can see here almost 100,000 going to Buenos Aires and other parts. So there's this idea now that we're talking about that we should call Latin America Afro-Latin America to account for the large Black presence that makes up the region. And so we will see here in my talk, I hope, how they have contributed to the constitution and the history and the culture of Latin America. So the first section of my talk is about what I call armed resistance, very active resistance. So this is when enslaved groups, enslaved Africans, either through violence way or non-violence way, fled their condition of slavery. Of course, there was what is called in French petit marronage, which is maybe escaping for a weekend or one individual escaping, and then there is a big marronage, which is escape, right? People running away from slavery, forming communities. So these are known in Spanish as palenques, and in Brazil they're known as quilombos. And there were several successful palenques that lasted almost 100 years, over 100 years. So the first one in Mexico, outside of Veracruz, it was called San Lorenzo de los Negros, but it was led by Gaspar Yanga, who was born in Angola. And around 1579, people that were enslaved in Veracruz just began escaping slavery. So it wasn't an armed resistance, they just began escaping slavery and forming a community in what is today the town of Yanga right here. It's rugged terrain, and in 1610, the Spanish tried to subdue the slave and to undo their community, and the Spanish were not successful. So the Spanish drew a treaty with Yanga, and there was the Spanish recognized the sovereignty of Yanga and Yanga could remain a community, an independent community of free slaves, free Africans. And one of the conditions of the agreement was that they would not admit more runaway slaves, and that they would return runaway slaves. And Yanga lasted about 100 years, and then the Spanish came and eventually undid it. And in Mexico itself, there were many palenques. There's a community of Iguala, which started as a palenque in the colonial period and is still a community today. This is also the case of Palenque in Colombia, San Basilio de Palenque, which I will speak about in a little bit, that started as a free Black community, and it is still a community today, mainly Black. Another famous, in this case, a quilombo, was Palmares in Brazil. And it started in a similar way to San Lorenzo, in that slaves who were in Pernambuco, which at that time was the center of sugar production in the world. They had the largest sugar production in the world. Slaves in that very harsh conditions began escaping into the mountains, Serra de Palmares, because of all the palm trees in this mountain. And they form a community there, and they live there. And so at that time, Portuguese changed hands several times. The Dutch invaded and took over, but both European powers, the Portuguese and the Dutch, tried to undo Palmares as the Spanish tried to undo San Lorenzo. And they were unsuccessful until eventually the confederation that the Blacks have formed in Palmares weakened, and eventually they captured the leader, Zumbi, and he was executed. And today in Brazil, Zumbi has become a symbol of Black resistance, of Black power, of Black pride. So on the day that Zumbi was executed, September 8th, is celebrated in Brazil as National Black Awareness Day, and is popularly known as Zumbi Day. So he lives on as a symbol of Black resistance in Brazil, and joining the Black Lives Matter movement after Floyd's death and so many other deaths in the US. A Brazilian used this symbol to affirm their dignity and their lives. And so this is a map of some of the quilombos in Brazil. And this is a contemporary map because many quilombolas community survive to this day. And they are now protected territory in Brazil, although with the new government, he's trying to take that land away from the Afro-Brazilians that communally own them. But this shows how many palenques and how much resistance there was to the system of slavery in Brazil, as was the case in the rest of Latin America, as well as the US. There was always people trying to escape this horrible system. So I said a little about San Basilio de Palenque, which again began in a similar way to other palenques, in that enslaved Africans began escaping where they were being subjugated and went to a hard to reach place and were able to build community there. And some have survived to this day. And one example is San Basilio de Palenque. And up to the 90s, there was no roads to San Basilio. So it was even up to the 1990s, our days, it was impossible or very difficult to get there. I know an linguist who did research there, and he told me, he had to take a boat and go up and climb to get there. So isolation allowed these communities to survive and create their own languages, or preserve their own language, which combine African languages and Spanish. So just looking at the map of Latin America, I don't have any quilombos of map dotted here, but just imagine everywhere there is, wherever there is slavery, there is resistance, right? Wherever there is oppression, there is resistance. And so moving on to the second section of the resistance that I want to talk about today, everyday resistance and what I call joyful defiance, working on this idea, is that you did not have to fleeing was not the only way to resist the slavery society. So even if you were a free person in a slave society, you still lived in a society. The ontology of this society was anti-Black. You were at the bottom of the social hierarchy. So any simple act of living was a form of resistance and defiance, right? And so now we have this idea that the Black experience has been, since the Middle Ages, a struggle, but it's not only from that struggle also comes this joyful defiance that all that we have is not downtroddenness and this sad history, but we also have a history of celebrating our identity, our culture, forming community, forming culture in defiance of the system that wants to oppress us, and within the system itself. If we talk about Mexico City, going about it in Mexico City itself. So we will now look at some example of these forms of defiance, of joyful defiance. So we have everyday resistance. We have social agency that I'm gonna discuss some example of how people of African descent manage against the odds to garner social agency and exercise it to better their condition. We have cultural agency, which we'll also talk about. So the first institutions I want to talk about, and which in my research as Professor Hermetten research, when she did her wonderful dissertation that became her wonderful book, I have found that these institutions called cofradías in Spanish, irmandades in Portuguese, brotherhoods or confraternity in English, they form the most common form of social organization, not only for Blacks, but also for Spanish and indigenous people. So that in this sense, Blacks were borrowing from the society they were in, but giving these institutions a unique character that serve and address the condition of Black people wherever they were. So this is a list of kind of a number of Black confraternities. This number is updated, particularly thanks to Professor Hermetten's research, because when the research was done in the 70s, only 2 or 3 were listed for Mexico, and now we know at least that von Hermetten's research managed to list 59. So there were a lot. It was the second place after Brazil with most Black confraternities. Well, they were everywhere as this form of institution that allow Afro-descendants to address their condition. So one of their principal mission in terms of the social function was care for the sick and the poor. And this was responding to the world they were living in. Medical care was very rudimentary, but I'm now working on a case from Mexico where a group of Afro-Mexicans in 1568 asked for land to build a hospital, and it was denied them, and they never got to build a hospital. So in Mexico City, there was no institution where Black could care for themselves. So the cofradías kind of served as Medicare institution, and especially for the elderly and disabled. Sometimes enslaved people were free in old age, and the owner took no more responsibility over them. Even if you were free, you lost income in old age, and if you were disabled, of course, there was no infrastructure to care for you. So Cofradia did this. We have here a plan of a hospital that a cofradia in Peru, a Black cofradia in Peru managed to build, and it's a pretty good sized hospital that they managed to build, and it was modeled on the best hospital of the period and offered the best care they could. Another important element was burial of the members and poor Blacks. And in this way, it shows how confradías kind of fuse African beliefs and Christian beliefs. So historian Joseph Miller, who died recently, said that there is hardly any difference between medieval Europe and medieval Africa. And what he means by that is that these two worlds share a similar cosmology of community center, collective identity, a belief in an eternal soul, and a belief on the importance of a proper burial. So when Blacks joined or started cofradías, they found a way to continue those African traditions in the diaspora. Another way they served the community was making loans to members and non-members at low interest, and this helped members overcome difficulties and non-members. They also bought the freedom of enslaved people. If an enslaved member was known to have a particularly abusive master, they would buy the freedom of that member, which was possible in the Spanish and Portuguese systems. You could buy your own freedom. You could also buy it in the US. We know that Frederick Douglass got the money to buy his freedom. And the effects of these social functions is that they empower Afro-descendants as a group and individually. They felt that they were in charge of their lives, of their destiny. They foster kingship, group cohesion, and communal identities. They provided mutual assistance in a very precarious world where cofradías were indeed the only institution of assistance. They provided health and death insurance where there was, no other form of getting it. And cofradía was so important in this regard because up to the 19th century, health and burial, all of that was religious and run by the church or cofradías. So Blacks were taking a share of the system. They form community, lasting community. So in Brazil, a lot of the cofradías, Irmandades, they're called there, have survived and are still active today in Brazil. now they're under threat because evangelicals think they're an evil institution. And since the Brazilian government is somewhat allied with evangelicals, they're under threat from the government and people who consider them hedonists. But they have survived. In the rest of Latin America, they didn't survive for various reasons. They either became secular institutions. In Cuba, they became Black societies. And in Argentina, they became tango clubs and eventually just kept morphing into secular society, and they became intellectual club. But in Brazil, they still practice some of the rituals, some of the religious Catholic rituals that are described in colonial documents. And they allow self-governance. So you were an autonomous unit, you could govern yourself according to your rules, and you had some independence from the colonial government. They provided religious authority. The leaders of the cofradías, whether men or women, had some form of religious authority, which again was also a continuation of African traditions where men and women had these forms of religious authority. And they also provided social mobility. You were a member of a cofradia, you could save money, you could invest, and then you could become a landowner. You could find a way to get a better job, and these kind of advantages. And now I will move into the cultural functions, because these were institutions that fulfilled important social functions, but they also fulfill very important cultural functions. So ostensibly for the church, devotion had to be the primary reason for existence. And there is no reason to doubt that they were genuinely devout and genuinely Catholic, right? They were not hiding, but at the same time, there is also no doubt that they were able to fuse Catholic and African beliefs, because in the African mentality, these were not contradictory or heretical as the Catholic Church will believe. So we have here an image from Lisbon from the 18th century of a Black couple praying to the Virgin of the Rosary, which in Brazil and in the Portuguese world was the most common patron of Black Irmandades. They also engage in festive practices, and we will talk more about this momentarily, because this is one of the main focus of my research and the manuscript that Professor Hermetten now has in her hands. And artistic endeavors. So we're going to talk a little bit about the churches that they were able to build in Brazil. And they were also able to engage the talent of prominent artists in the colonial world. So going to the artistic endeavors, we have here 3 churches that Afro-Brazilian Irmandades built in Brazil. This is very important because, one, Brazil was the only place where Irmandades were able to build their own churches. These churches are very beautiful. We're going to see some of the interior. They include art by the most recognized artists of the moment, which meant that the brothers had money to commission their work. And also these churches are still the place of worship of these brotherhoods that are still active today. We have identified 7 in all Brazil, and these are only 3. So in the churches, from the facade, it was a public statement, and the facade would have been what most people would have seen, especially people who didn't go into the church. And there is a historian of art that talks about architecture as public speech. So I think of these churches as a form of public speech, to which the brothers that build them and brothers and sisters that build them spoke to the broader community about their devotion, their corporate identity, as well as their artistic and social agency. And then in the inside of the churches, so if the facade can look like any other Baroque church in Brazil, the inside of the church leaves no doubt that these churches belong to Black brotherhoods, because they imprinted their identity on these churches. So in the church of St. Iphigenia, in the ceiling, they took 4 doctors of the church and painted them Black. So here we have Gregory the Great. You may know who he is. He was a pope. He is credited with promoting Gregorian chant, which was for the longest time the mode of singing in the Catholic Church. But if you look at Renaissance art and Baroque art and European art, Gregory, as you can see here in the lower left, was painted white. But in the church of St. Iphigenia, they painted him Black, right? So they were manipulating Catholic iconography to make this statement. Of course, this was not problematic because Gregory was from North Africa. So there is a possibility that he may have been brown or Black. And this is 200 years before people in the Catholic Church will have a movement to ask for Black saints and Black Jesus. So Afro-Brazilian brotherhoods were doing this in the 18th century. This is the interior of the second church in Ouro Preto. This church is unique because it has the shape of the church is 2 connected ovals, and there are only 4 churches in the world with this shape, and one of them belongs to this brotherhood, which was able to commission the architect to design this church for them. And this architect at the time was very famous in his town. And so he was able to commission, they were able to commission him to do this church. In the interior, as you can see again, you have the Virgin of the Rosary, St. Anthony of Noto, and St. Benedict the Moor. These are Black saints, and we're going to talk a little bit more about them. And these were the Black saints that the Black brotherhoods worship. So they had an Afrocentric iconography and an Afrocentric faith, right? An Afrocentric Afro-Catholicism, an Afrocentric form of Catholicism. This is the same church, and this is like, as you go in the door, you look up and you see this, you will see this image. And this image speaks about the brotherhood, that it is of the Rosary, the angel giving the saint the Rosary, and it's a symbol of the brotherhood. So it's emblazoned there as their emblem. But again, it's a Black saint, whereas in the original story of a saint receiving the Rosary is St. Dominic, who's a white saint receiving the Rosary. So they rewrote here the Rosary as they did in the other church with St. Gregory. So some of the saints that were very popular, and there's a new book about these saints. It's called Global Catholicism. And so one thing about these saints is that they have been found in Brazil and Cuba to have a lot of colorful clothing and a lot of colorful jewelry. And this connects them to these African statues, which are called Nikisi in singular and Nikinsi in the plural, which are African deities. So again, we can see here the fusing of religions, the fusing of worldviews. African and Catholic in the saints, but not hiding something, but believing in both in one, joining the two. We have here the sealing of the third church, of the blue church, and this is an important sealing because there is another similar sealing in this town by a known artist, Jose Joaquin Rocha, who was very famous. And this sealing is also attributed to him. And it is believed that the brothers were able to commission him to do the sealing for them. So they were able to commission the most important artists in their town to do their sealing. Again, there's also a possible reading of the sealing as both a representation of the Virgin Mary, but also of the Oruba goddess of the sea, who's always represented coming out of the sea. So in the painting, the blue could be the sea and the Virgin Mary, Yemanja, the kind of again, of fusing of cosmologies and religions. And not only were Afro-Brazilian brotherhoods able to commission the most important artists of the time, these artists themselves were Black and members of these brotherhoods. So here we have Mestre Valentim, who was a mulatto in Rio de Janeiro. He was a member of a brotherhood in Rio de Janeiro, and he designed the church there in Rio de Janeiro. And also at the end of the 18th century, there was a great fire that destroyed Rio, and Mestre Valentim was one of the urban planners who planned the new city. So if you go to Rio, you will see, if you go to the old town, the city that he planned. So this painting here is Mestre Valentim giving his plan of the city to the viceroy. And this is how we have this painting. Another Black artist was Aleijandinho, who is considered the best artist of colonial Brazil. His work is everywhere, and he was a mulatto. He was a member of a brotherhood, and he also did some stonework for some of the churches in the town where he lived. Now we're going to move to Festive Black Kings and Queen, which is another facet of Black brotherhoods, and is a facet that I have focused the most in my book. So this is an image that was produced at the end of the 18th century. The artist Carlos Julião, who was Italian, but then hired himself to the Portuguese Empire. He traveled to Brazil, and he certainly saw these festivals in Brazil. His image are kind of problematic because he decontextualizes the event. But we have very few evidence for all of these events. So his images are very important. In my book, I focus on some events in Mexico City. What's going on there? So, sorry. So the first one is a festival in 1610 where two Black brotherhoods appear with their king. And in the first one that we have here, they appear in a castle. So this is using the idea of Baroque architecture. So they're participating, they're using Baroque festival culture for adding the tradition of African king. And this is a tradition that has been traced again back to Africa, giving what we call this cultural continuity of these practices. And then the second one is they came out with the king on an elephant, and this other one was more common that coming out in a castle. And so you can see here in the image is an image from the Royal Opera in France in 1629. They had this coming out, this African king coming out, and something similar is happening in Mexico. And I have found other example in Spain. Then we have the best description that we have of the king itself. And unfortunately, we don't have a description of the queen. We have the images that Julião made. He made 4 images of the queen. And we know from other research that the queen had a more important role than the king. But being the society that it was, the person who wrote this just gave a description of the king. And we can see all the lavish things that the king is wearing, which is an ostentation, right, of power, of royal opulence. And I have compared these examples to description of kings in Africa around the same time. And kings in Africa quickly adapted European regalia of sovereignty. And so again, we have here this kind of continuity of adapting these kinds of royal effect regalia. So I will conclude by talking about what are the implications of this research, of these findings, what I call effects. So first, the effects of culture of the cofradías and Festive King. It fused African and European Christian worldviews, as I have been saying. It allowed Blacks to adapt African festive religious practice to a Christian context. It allowed them to form Creole culture, which is a mixture of African, European, and American cultural elements, so that when we say we should be talking about Afro-Latin America, if you think of Latin America, you wouldn't have salsa, merengue, bachata, reggaeton, without the African beat that informed these musical genre. You wouldn't have carnival without these traditions. Developed as an Afro-Latin American music, and the most important and immediate for them effect was to redefine their position in colonial society. We haven't found too much evidence of what happened after a festival, but we have identified these spaces as spaces of negotiation where they were negotiating to redefine their position, to seek favors from the government and the ruling class. And again, by participating in public events, they're intervening in the public sphere and making statements about the group, so that if you have a bad notion of what Blackness is, you get here another image, a positive image of symbolic sovereignty, of rich customs, and the use of the Baroque culture, the use of these expensive and lavish costumes and carriages. And this is an image from Black music from Peru. And then the implications of the broader research, to conclude, is to study the African diaspora beyond slavery, which is a call that some of us have been making. And it's happening now. We are thinking more and more about the African diaspora in Europe and the America in the early modernity, beyond the institution of slavery. To consider Latin American Blackness beyond the Caribbean. Many times people think of Black Latin America, they may think the Caribbean region in some cases, especially if you're in a language department like me. But you know, who thinks of Mexico, Chile, Argentina as Black? Well, they have all this heritage. tango is a music that comes from an African dance. It's a Black music. To understand Afro-descendants' role in the social and cultural becoming of Latin America, as I was saying, there are so many things that will be missing from what Latin American culture is without African contribution. And most importantly, in terms of reevaluating the past, is to understand the various strategies that Afro-descendants use to form community and identity during the era of slavery. And thank you very much for listening to me, and I hope my English was not too
Thank
bad.
you so much, Professor Valerio. So I'm here to take questions, and I just wanted to say, I know the two of us would be happy to talk all day about this topic, so please ask any questions and we'll be happy to answer them. I mean, to me, the importance of this talk is this idea that, you know, Latin America is really Afro-Latin America, and there's an incredible vibrancy of the African diaspora, a culturally resistance, and kind of like when we're talking about brotherhoods and buildings and all this, actually like institutional. So it's not, it's carved in stone, literally. I mean, that's what we saw. This is a carved in stone cultural heritage. And this is really the direction that myself and Dr. Valerio and others are going. Yeah, and so you can do questions in the Q&A, and I see some coming up, where the kind of things that we're talking about are subjectivity, interior life, you know, festivities, like the phrase a joyful resistance. It's such a beautiful, positive way that things are going. Fashion, these kind of opulence, you know, material culture. These are kind of the directions that we have in this field of study to really look at this strong and vibrant cultural continuity between Africa and the Americas. So just some thoughts I had to hopefully get some questions going. So I see a question from Marcelo, who's our PhD student from Brazil originally. And he says, do you find any, and we got some good questions. I like the next one too. So let's make sure we have time for all these. Marcelo says, do you find any other evidence of the use of Catholic saints to represent Yoruba gods and goddesses, such as Yemanja in the church ceiling? I mean, I feel like, of course, everywhere, right? Everyone can see this, right?
There's a lot of evidence. So, and there's a book. I'm blanking on the name. I can send it along. Someone who studies Cuba. So he studies. He did a whole book on McKinsey in Cuba. And then there's several articles. There was a great scholar, Elizabeth Kitty, who died after her book came out. But she talks about Yemanja and confraternity art in her book. And then there's another article, book chapter by Marina Melo Zosa, who has done all this work in Brazil, where she talks about the Kinsey in Brazilian churches. And I mean, you can still go to some churches and find these similarities. And the Marina Melo Sosa, when she talks in her book chapter, she's using an anthropologist report of someone who went at the end of the 19th century and saw them in Brazil. So yeah, there's a lot of evidence about this. Yes.
Yeah, I would definitely say anybody who wants to read a great book, Elizabeth Kitty is a beautiful book called Blacks of the Rosary, right? Real easy to remember. Blacks of the Rosary. It's so good because she does like what Professor Valerio did, getting the real origins, and she takes it to the present day. It's such a beautiful book. The cover is so beautiful. It's just very vibrant and exciting. And she does a lot about 19th century politics, early 20th century politics, and the Black Brotherhoods. It's just a great book. So yeah, we had a great question from student I don't know, or person I don't know, Alicia Dolan. How do women play a role in this time period? That's the question we love, right?
And so I mean, the evidence is that you talk in your book, you have a whole chapter, and you have done so much work on women, but your chapter on your book on brotherhood, you have a whole chapter about leadership role of women in the Brotherhood, and other researchers have also found this. And if you think of slave societies, they were designed in such a way that women had, for some reason, a little more freedom, as Frederick Douglass called it, relative freedom. It wasn't freedom, but it was, a little more freedom. So the evidence is one that women had more leadership in the brotherhoods, in the communities. They were the ones taking care of sick people, burial as well. And also as queen, they were also having a prominent role. The form that this performance has taken in Panama is the queen is in charge. The king is secondary. And another one is that we have also found that women, because of the relative freedom, also had more opportunity to accumulate capital. And we have found that women were owners of homes, of land, more often than men. So yeah, I mean, this is, women were in charge. I mean, and Black women have been in charge, right? They have kept us going.
Yeah, that's like, I mean, that's when I was doing this research 20 years ago, and I was seeing such and such woman, and their names were like Maria Angola, Juana Congo. So these were African women in Mexico starting these organizations, raising money, making donations. It's just really great stuff. Okay, so, and of course, like there's a lot of new
Yeah,
work on fashion, and
yeah.
a lot of women owned slaves. Sorry if people are hearing the drums in my house. I don't know if you can hear that.
There's that book, new book, it's called Exquisite Slaves, which is about women and clothing. And it means it's about women who own slaves and women, how clothing function, but women are also the one leading the charge there.
Yeah, Exquisite Slaves.
Yeah,
And
Tamara Walker, yeah.
yeah, and that is actually, she's signed up to speak with us, I believe, in March.
Oh, that's wonderful. You're gonna get to hear her.
Yeah, I believe, and her book is Exquisite Slaves, about these wealthy African descent women. All right, so another question, anonymous. We have, did this African diaspora on the South America, and of course it's also including North America, which is Mexico, or Spanish North America, but that's just my editorial. Did this African diaspora on the South American continent reflect on Catholic Christian tradition in Europe and culture, if any, or other regions?
Right, so what I'm talking about is an early form of Afro-Catholicism. Catholicism was a religion. If you were in the Spanish Empire, the Portuguese Empire, you had to be Catholic. There were so many works to convert people. Also, people have been converted in Africa. And the evidence that we have is that Africans were now using confraternity to hide Africans' beliefs. The evidence that we have suggests that they were generally converted and that they were Catholic and devout, but that they did not see contradictory to fuse, right? And I resist the idea of synchronism and all of that, to fuse these beliefs seamlessly, right? Because they didn't see contradiction. So for them, they were being good Catholics, right? And so, yeah, so it's, all of that is going on there. And I mean, in the 80s in the US, you will have the Afro-Catholic movement. And this is kind of an early example of how they started. And of course, Black Cofradia started in Europe. And so they brought, some traditions from Europe. Yes.
I really like it how you avoid the term syncretism. That's not really a word that we use in Latin America. I know my training with people who work on indigenous Latin America or Spanish America, William Taylor, I try to avoid that word, because I totally agree with you. These people are incredibly great Catholics. They testify that all the time. I love the Virgin Mary, et cetera, et cetera. I give so much money for these saints. I'm a fantastic Catholic. At the same time, you can't deny other aspects of your heritage, right, that come out in these festivals and whatnot, right? So it's like Yeah, I mean, I think like our stuff for indigenous people in Latin America really helps us understand how you can be both things at one time. You can be culturally indigenous or culturally have a cultural heritage of Africa, but be a very devout Catholic at the same time. Yeah, so someone asked, curious about the language of research in this field. How much is in Spanish and Portuguese?
Well, the language of the research produced. So for Brazil, most of it is in Portuguese. In Spanish, I must say that in terms of Spanish America, very few people are doing this there, and that most of the research is actually in English. You know, I'm writing in English. Professor Merton is writing in English. A lot of the people in this series that were writing in English were in U.S. academies. There are people doing it in Spanish America, but not that many. Thankfully, it's growing. But a lot of people are focused on contemporary Afro-Latin America and not the colonial period. The documents themselves are, of course, on the original language, but the research is, and the sad part is that for Brazil, there's very little in English. A lot of it is being done in Portuguese. Yeah.
You're definitely not going to get any of our documents in English.
Right.
I don't know, maybe the one famous thing, Thomas Gage,
Yes. Oh, yes. Thomas Gage, yeah, he went to Mexico and he wrote, well, this very anti-Hispanic book.
Yeah, and that's like one source out of a million that you could happen upon in English. All right, so we had a couple of our professors asking, Professor Amy Kerlinger, the religious and cultural syncretism here. So interesting, your use of Catholic religious architecture, especially the church in an oval shape, and your attention to music and dance make me think of James Fernandez's ethnography Buiti, where he explores the way architecture affects bodily comportment in sacred spaces. He called this dynamic architectonics. I wonder if you have sources that speak to how people moved in and through these religious spaces. I mean, I think from your book, I think you're attempting that in the best way that we can from our
Right.
sources, right? Yeah.
Yes. So in the colonial sources, there's very little attention to the body. So in contemporary, if I went to Brazil today to one of these churches and I saw them dance, I will see and I love this idea of architectonics, and I'm going to look further into that. So there's a chapter in the book where I try to reconstruct these dances and these movements. So thank you for that idea. I mean, that's just, I need to research this idea and pay more attention to this. Yes, thank you.
I know Professor Kerlinger is very up on religious theory relating to religious studies. So yeah, it's that where you and I are like, you know, we're kind of ethnographers almost. You know, we spend so much time on the documents. Maybe we need to learn a little bit more on the theory. I don't know. But okay, so another professor of ours who's actually our Brazilian specialist is Carrie Mace, and it's a coincidence, her last name. She says, thinking of the iconography and the memorialization of Blackness in public spaces like churches, do you see commonalities across the Americas in the ways these representations have been integrated, perhaps co-opted or even so-called whitewashed into national histories and how they exist in public memory today? And I read a lot on that topic for Brazil. I think it's a very lively one for Brazil. Yeah.
So that happens in Brazil, where these churches are now in UNESCO World Heritage Sites, because when they were built, they were outside the town. But as the town grew, they're now in what is considered the historical center of town. And in Brazil, almost all the ones in Brazil are part of a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And Ouro Preto today is like an exterior museum. It's like the best preserved colonial town I have seen, where if you go to Mexico City, the colonial buildings are there, but they're part of the city that has grown naturally, if you will, whereas in Ouro Preto it feels very artificial. So that has happened in Brazil, as you know. But then in Spanish America, these monuments have not survived. I haven't found a confraternity chapel in Mexico or Peru. Now in Lisbon in Lisbon, they have survived, and so that image I show, well, that image is now in a museum. It used to be in a sacristy, but then the altars are still the altars of these brotherhoods that are no more, but the altars are still there. But in Lisbon, a lot of people don't know about these altars. Spain has a unique case because they have what is considered the oldest Black confraternity, brotherhood, in Seville. But in the 18th century, it became a white confraternity. So if you want a case of whitewashing. And then since then, it has been a white confraternity, brotherhood, and it's still active today. They still call themselves Los Negritos, but they're not. They haven't been white. They haven't been Black since the 18th century. And the 18th century is, this moment when whitewashing, if you will, begins to happen. So it's significant that this happens to this brotherhood. And the reason why the whites took over is because this was considered one of the oldest brotherhood in the city. So it had a lot of importance in terms of where it went in the procession. And so they took over it. That has not been kind of nationalized in Spain, but it has happened in the city. So Brazil will be the place where this kind of, like, in Pelourinho, they want, it's a tourist destination today. If you go to Salvador, sometimes disrupting the life of the Brotherhood, right? Because this is still their sanctuary, and tourists want to come and take picture, including this academic tourist. Yes.
I just, we have time for 1 or 2 other questions. If anybody has other ones, we can go to maybe 10 past, if that's okay with you, Professor Valerio. We
Yes.
happy to do that. Trying to think. I was gonna say that the I think the importance of the talk is really good to think about when you're looking at Latin America very broadly, from Mexico all the way to Brazil. And especially like when you point out quilombos and palenques, those rebel communities, they are everywhere, and also in the Anglo world in Jamaica, right? They're everywhere. So there's been this dozens, or if not hundreds, of rebel communities throughout the Americas for like hundreds of years. I mean, you speak about in your book manuscript that potentially that first uprising rebellion in the 1530s, right? That not much is known about. So literally since the 1530s, people of African descent and Africans have been rebelling in the Americas. You made that really clear at the beginning. So it's just that's our historical perspective that I think is really important for people who are maybe thinking of the U.S. In a little bit more isolation. How long of a tradition that there exists of resistance in a variety of ways, right?
And Jane Lander, she has worked. So when Florida was Spanish, people would flee from the south to the Spanish side, and then other people Black people in the Spanish side would help him. So that's an interesting frontier place. And then when the U.S. still had slavery, people were fleeing to Mexico. So there's also that, there's that kind of Latin American connection. And as you say, from the beginning, people of Africans, enslaved Africans, I mean, the indigenous people were enslaved as well. At that time, they were resisting this form, any form of slavery. Yeah.
And then also, I'm just trying to underscore in whatever time we have left, and feel free to anybody to interject with a question. Also we have, as you pointed out, these monuments, these heroes of African resistance going back to the 1600s, long-term towns. So they became institutional towns that the European colonizers had to recognize because they couldn't defeat them or they couldn't access them, right? There was no way to access them. There was no way to militarily defeat them. They just couldn't. So they lasted for generations. Again, this is going back 400 years. It's just, I think it's really important to see this is a really long tradition. you know, a very long heritage of resistance that includes violent resistance, that includes creating completely separate communities, you know.
Right. And so uh, well, one thing I wasn't so I haven't been to the territory where Yanga used to be. I know that Palmares was difficult to access. I know that Palenque was easy to access. But sometimes I wonder if in the Mexican report about San Lorenzo, if the Spanish are saying, "Oh, we lost because the terrain was too harsh," because this is what the report says. And I might want to go back and see if the terrain supports their claim. I haven't heard anyone say that it's a false claim, and I haven't been there. But sometimes they were also when they couldn't, you know, when they got defeated, when the Spanish were, you know, when the colonizers were the defeated, when the hunters became the hunted, they found excuses to say, "Oh, we lost because this and that." It was never because there were brave African warriors defending their freedom and autonomy. And one more thing that I didn't mention is, you know, I talked to the festive king is a form, right, of discoursive sovereignty, symbolic sovereignty, but there was also real sovereignty, right? And this is why also the festive king were problematic for colonial authorities sometimes, because they reminded them about the real sovereignty, the real Black sovereignty that was also there.
It's just obviously it's a topic that I love, and as I said, I could talk about it all day. Just seeing if there's any quiet audience members who want to throw in one last question or two, because I just, for me, you know, I teach this topic. Oh, look, we have Natalia Bueno, who we know well in our school. Asks if you are familiar with Bencos Piojo and San Basilio de Palenque. I think Natalia is speaking from a Colombian, a little bit of a Colombian expertise background.
Sounds like, oh, she's the one who wrote to me. I'm like,
Yeah,
that
yeah.
sounds familiar. Yes, she wrote to me. So, well, hi, Natalia.
Oh,
So, right, I haven't done too much research on San Basilio. I know that he was the you know, the founder, and there is a Netflix series which is a bad series because they try to tell the story of Palenque, and you've probably seen it, but they use a white character as the center character, and it's even called La Esclava Blanca, and so I mean, I don't know what they were thinking, but you know, well,
I
first of all, Netflix has no knowledge of what they were doing, but yeah, so yeah. And so we know the founders and the leaders of these palenques. We know many of their names, but also has been documented that they were not monarchy rulers. They ruled as a council, right? So it was a different form of rule than, it was a rule more informed by African tradition than the European tradition of monarchy rule.
I hadn't seen that show. It's called Esclava Blanca, right? White. Yes, somebody recommended that to me, and I'm like, that name is putting me off. Just for those in the audience, this show about the rebel community is called White Slave in English.
And then there's the other one, Siempre Bruja, always a witch.
I wrote up, I screamed on that.
Right.
It's so despicable. This is another show that's about Siempre Bruja. Maybe the remaining audience members know a little bit about this. It was pretty popular, and it's about a person that I've written out about a lot, Paula de Egulus, a very famous love magic practitioner, etc. I can't resist, since we're making fun of shows and it was better on Netflix. They portray her as learning all of her knowledge from white men.
Right.
And this is a huge, vibrant community, like we've been talking about, of African diaspora women in the Caribbean who share knowledge, and her parents are African, and you can picture her in different locations of the Caribbean, learning this knowledge from other African descent women. And yet in the show, it's these like white magicians. It's just, we need to protest this.
Yeah, better to read Pablo Gomez, The Experiential Caribbean, about
Yes.
the transfer of knowledge about Afro-descent. So next semester, no, well, when I come back, maybe 2022, when I come back from my junior sabbatical, I'm going to be teaching Afro-Latin America in film and television. And what we do is deconstruct most of the movies and shows, because most of them, the representation most of the time has been negative, unless the team making the film or the show is Black, is always a mess.
Yeah, of course, there's I'd wonder what you think about the classic, what is the one on Quilombo? Is it called Quilombo or Zumbi?
Right, Quilombo, yeah.
Yeah, and that's a very famous Brazilian movie that
Yeah,
portrays.
and so going back to the question of why washing, and it's a utopic representation of the whole thing, right? It is not faithful to the event, and so I will recommend the Kingdom Angola Yanga, Kingdom of Runaway Slaves, which is a graphic novel that came out 3 years ago. Yeah, and so this Afro-Brazilian graphic artist, he has made several things and is now being read a lot in English, which I'm very happy. And he's doing runaway slaves, and so he did a very great graphic novel about Angola Yanga.
It's called Angola Young. That sounds awesome. That
Yeah,
sounds fantastic.
Kingdom of Runaway Slaves. Yeah,
Yeah,
and it's
that's
an easy read because it's a graphic novel. So I think we have another question.
yeah, that somebody would like to know what you're doing in future when you're on sabbatical.
Book
What's your
number two.
next
Book,
project in a sense?
so book number two is I was telling Professor Bohemetna before. It's going to be my dissertation was very broad, so I had to narrow it for the first book, and then the second book I'm going to take the rest of the dissertation. So I have a chapter, an article coming out on the churches that I presented. So that's going to be a chapter in the new book. I'm going to call it Radical Blackness, Afro-Creole Subjectivities in the Americas, and talking about these everyday forms of resistance. So junior sabbatical book number two. And revising book number one once I get reviews from people, yes. So no rest for the wicked.
I'm sure the reviews will be excellent though, because I know it is a very good book. And maybe in a year or so when it comes out, people who are listening here should go out and buy it if you want to learn about. I've been reading it myself. If you want to learn about these particular festivals, and really, Professor Valerio is looking at like these fragmentary information about different festivals in Mexico City that are African expressions, culture, community, etc. And then in order to really understand what they are, he's using like tons and tons of different sources from around the diaspora. So you really get this feeling of this almost like very cohesive culture from medieval Spain and Portugal to up through Enlightenment Brazil. And it's just this whole geographic and cultural area that's very strong. And that's what's important, I think, for us as historians to emphasize that this isn't like fragmented, barely clinging on stuff. Like this is front and center. I loved it. Like reading about like there's an African women dance group in Mexico, like in the 1500s and 1600s. I mean, that's what we're talking about. There's beautiful processions, and it's very, very vibrant. I mean, just to think there's an actual dance group.
Right.
Imagine, it seems so modern. And, for us, like Alvin Ailey or these different groups, Dance Theater of Harlem. Oh, wow. Well, they had that 400 years ago in Mexico City. It's just so incredible. So I don't know if there's no other audience questions, but I really have, I guess we're 5:15, so we better shut things down. But I appreciate everyone.
Thank you everyone for coming.
Actually,
Thank
don't let me forget, I got to do my share screen at the end here. Sorry, I always forget this. So here we have, oh no, actually, I got confused. Our first speaker next term is Danielle Terrasas Williams. I'm sorry.
Oh,
yeah, because they're both two great new scholars.
yes.
So yeah, she's the first one talking, and then we have, so that'll be February 26th, probably at 4 p.m. as well. We'll definitely, this information will be circulated more. Then we have Michael Dickinson, who takes us back up to a little bit more US Anglo history. So that's something for those who are perhaps that's a little more familiar. And then we have Carmen Thompson. I think she's going to actually speak in February. She's a local person here, so I'm hoping she'll speak about Portland and maybe even current situations. And then in spring we have people upcoming that we just working out some of the details still. So I appreciate everybody joining us today and staying over and asking questions. And again, please email me if you have any questions, or maybe even you can track down Professor Valerio at Washington University if you have something you want to ask him, if he doesn't mind. But thanks everybody, and everyone have a good night, and we'll hope to see you in winter for those other talks.